Hello everybody. First of all, let me thank the Arabic Linguistic Forum and the University of Leeds for all the effort they made to organize this conference in such special and challenging conditions. My paper will present a technique that I personally created and applied for the elicitation of linguistic data. It is my opinion that this technique is very useful to target specific linguistic forms and to obtain new information on how these are actually used or indexed in a community, while at the same time circumventing the problem of the observer's paradox as much as possible. First of all, I'll briefly introduce the research context in which I found it necessary to develop this technique. I then illustrate the theoretical issue which I needed to address in the choice of the data collection method, that is, the observer's paradox. After that, I'll explain how this technique, which I call the hidden camera test, is structured, and which results it yielded in the case of my research. Finally, I'll move to the conclusions. I created this test in the context of a larger study on variation in Moroccan Arabic in the town of Temara, which, as you can see, is a center located on the Atlantic coast between the cities of Rabat and Casablanca. This is the most urbanized area of Morocco, as it has been attracting huge immigration fluxes from all over the country in the last 100 years. Temara, in particular, saw its population increase 14-fold in 42 years. It was therefore interesting to see what happened to linguistic variation in such a new, mixed socio-demographic context. As the vast majority of my informants are men, the following discussion will be limited to male speakers in Temara. One of the variable linguistic features I studied was the alternation between g, the voiced velar stop, and q, the voiceless uvular stop, in lexemes whose root contains what corresponds to kaf in classical Arabic. I will call these two variants gef and kaf henceforth. It is important to note that gef and kaf have phonological status in Temara, as they distinguish words such as gra, courgette, and qara, bottle. In the speech of Temarese men, some of the lexemes concerned are always realized with gef, some other are always realized with kaf, and some other vary both at the inter-individual and at the intra-individual level. My research was focused on this last group of lexemes, as I aimed at finding out how speakers choose between gef and kaf when the choice is available in their repertoire. My general research goal was to study what type of social values Temara speakers assigned to variable linguistic features. This is why, after collecting a huge data corpus in Temara, I decided to focus on 5 lexemes for which I observed alternation between gef and kaf, and the social meaning of which seemed to be affected by their assignment to either phonological class. These 5 lexemes are, as you can see, waqif or waqif, uqif or uqaf, قدام or قدام, القا or القا, and قبل or قبل. However, as it happened, I didn't have enough occurrences of these lexemes to discuss the motivations and social meanings of their phonological alternation, which is obvious considering they're not the most used words in Moroccan Arabic, although they're common enough. Therefore, I decided to conduct another shorter field study in order to make up for data on these lexemes. Throughout my research, I found myself having to face a key theoretical issue, that is, obtaining data that reflect common use as closely as possible. Lebov observed that the speaker's most coherent and spontaneous variety of speech, what he called the vernacular, only emerges when the minimum amount of attention is given to speech. This means that the data collected will always tend not to correspond to everyday talk, as the situation of the interview, which is by far the most used technique of data collection in social linguistics, usually triggers the informant to exert attention on their speech. This is the well-known observer's paradox. However, as we all know, Lebov's influential position has been criticized. Eckert and other authors, for example, have stood against the view of variation as a one-dimensional movement from the standard to the vernacular and back. Connected to this, it's been observed that attention paid to speech is not the only relevant factor lying behind variation in the speech of an individual, with many other psychological, social, and situational motivations intervening. Based on this critique, my position is that, In order for the data to be relevant to the study of variation, we should not be concerned with the generic concept of attention paid to speech, but we should rather be able to distinguish as much as possible when an individual's linguistic judgments are interfering with her or his way of speaking, for example, when he's making metalinguistic judgments. So what I was concerned for in my research was to collect samples of speech which was unaffected by this interference. This meant that techniques such as questionnaires or word lists had to be discarded, as well as all other techniques that implied explicitly asking the informants how they pronounced a specific word. This was a challenging issue, as what I needed at this point was data on 5 specific lexemes which, as I said, do not occur very often in Moroccan Arabic speech. The ideal solution for me would have been eliciting the forms in an indirect way, that is, without the informants being aware of which form I was targeting, which is something Lebov himself suggested doing back in the days. This led me to the elaboration of the hidden camera test. Here's how it's structured. At least 2 participants are needed. We can call them A and B. They should be familiar with each other and used to speak in the targeted variety with each other. This way, 1. The scientific character of the situation is more likely to become less relevant, and 2. Speech can be maximized between the participants. For my purposes, they also needed to be fluent in Moroccan Arabic. 3 videos, each showing a different hidden camera prank, are selected for each participant. Each video is connected to 3 tasks. The test starts when the first video is shown to one of the participants, say A. The first task, which I call viewing, is assigned to A, who has to watch and understand what the prank is about. This way, A takes on the narrator's role. The second task, which I call verbalization, is also assigned to A, who has to explain the prank to B, who has not watched the video. This way, B takes on the listener's role. The third and last task, which I call answering, is assigned to B, who has to answer a few questions asked by the researcher with the declared purpose of checking if he or she has understood A's account. Once this is over, it is now B's turn to take on the narrator's role and watch her or his first video, and tasks are exchanged between the 2 participants. This continues until each participant has watched, verbalized, and answered questions about 3 pranks. Now, the purpose of the test is that of eliciting the forms desired in an indirect way. How can this be done? The most obvious way is by asking targeted questions during the answering task. To give an example, I asked the following question for a video in which the prank victim was a driver who tried to move his car forward and jump a red light. The question I asked was, "Ulli sajg, x'nu kidir? Wax kirġa l-lor?" And the participant answered, "Ma rġax l-lor, għajżid il-qeddan." So what I asked was, "And the guy who's driving, what does he do? Does he go back?" And the informant answered, "No, he doesn't go back, he goes forward." And قدام, forward, was the lexeme I was targeting, which means that this attempt was successful. However, the pranks were chosen so that the targeted lexemes were likely to occur in the narrator's verbalizations as well. This is why the second aim of the test was to have the targeted lexemes produced as many times as possible, to compare occurrences in different contexts. The usefulness of this comparison was proven as different contexts actually triggered the use of different phonemes for the same lexemes in some informant speech. In the case shown here, the same informant during the same session produces waqf in answering one of my questions, and then produces waqif while explaining another prank to the other participant. The context of occurrence were even increased as I let the participants violate the speaking turns. As for example, the listener was allowed to ask the narrator questions both during the verbalization and the answering tasks, and the narrator was left free to interfere, to a certain extent, in the answering task. This table, which continues on 2 slides, shows the global results which I obtained from all the 17 test sessions that I performed and recorded in Temara, each one with 2 participants. All test takers were men under 40. Every line of the table corresponds to an informant, who is indicated by a 2 or 3 letter code. 2 of the 5 lexemes almost invariably occurred with a calf, as GAF was only chosen by 1 or 2 informants, so they were not included in the table, as the sample was not big enough to yield useful information on the variation concerning these 2 lexemes. The following discussion will therefore be limited to the 3 lexemes which showed more variation across the test sessions. These are the 3 lexemes that you can see in the table. In the table, different nuances of green were used for the informants who always chose calf, which globally was the most recurrent phoneme, informants who used a little gaf, and strong gaf users. In addition, the yellow color indicates cases in which the same informant alternated the 2 phonemes for the same lexeme in the course of the session. This happened almost 3 times out of 10, if we just consider the cases in which an informant uttered the lexeme at least twice. All this indicates that strong variation exists for these lexemes in the informant sample, both at the inter-individual and at the intra-individual level. The analysis of the test takers' performances aimed at finding out what the reasons lay behind this variation. To discuss inter-individual variation, I used ethnographic data that I could collect on my informants, many of whom I was acquainted with. Although no statistic study was conducted, some trends emerged from this analysis. The clearest one is that GAF was more often avoided by informants who had more opportunities of creating social ties in other bigger urban centers, such as Rabat and Casablanca, or that were more involved in activities associated to Western-style modernity, or implying an improvement of social status. This seemed to indicate that young men in Temara considered calf, a variant associated with modernity and refinement, to be more prestigious when chosen for these lexemes. This is interesting if compared to what happens in other Arabic-speaking cities, such as Amman in Jordan, another town of recent development, in which men are gradually switching to gaf, a variant indexed with rurality and tradition. To explain variation at the intra-individual level, I focused on those cases in which the same informant alternated the 2 phonemes for the same lexeme. My first approach was to apply Bell's model of audience design, which however could not explain many of these cases in a coherent manner. By applying this model, it then emerged in the course of the analysis that most of the phoneme switches, 58 out of 89, could actually be reconducted to a single communicative purpose, which was not directly connected to audience design. That is, the need of distinguishing new and given information in the context of information structure. I use the terms new and given applied to information respectively as synonyms of focused and presupposed, as these are defined by Ward and Berner. According to them, focused information is just that portion of an utterance which augments or updates the hearer's view of the common ground, whereas presupposed information is the information that the speaker assumes is already part of the common ground, that is either silent or inferable in context. On the following slide, an audio excerpt will be played containing a clear example of alternation between calf and gaf for the signaling of information structure.
ديك المكانه كتبقى الدور واحد شويه كتوقف فوقت ما وقف هاد المكانه كيوقفوا حتى ديك الناس كل كيكونوا كيديروا شي حاجه حتى كيوقفوا وداك اللي كيكون معاهم زايد كيتعجب كيدخل الشك شي كينوض كيبقى يدير لهم بحال هكا كيبقى يشوف زعما علاش هاد الناس واقفين عاد شويه عاوتاني كيتحركوا كتحرك المكانه كيتحركوا حتى هما عاوتاني كتعاود توقف مكانه وكيوقفوا هما عاوتاني.
In the excerpt, the informant DMN, who was resuming the prank he had just watched to the other participant, can be heard using the lexeme uqaf 3 times with qaf before switching to gaf after a few seconds. In the rest of the excerpt, he maintains the gaf on this lexeme and on another one, wagif. To understand why he did this, we can split the text into information units, each unit containing a piece of new information and several pieces of given information that provide the necessary background knowledge for the listener to understand the new information. In the prank concerned, A group of actors freeze their movements in synchrony with a clock hanging on the wall, which contains a mechanism that makes it stop every few seconds. In the first two information units taken from DMN's verbalization, the action of stopping constitutes the new piece of information, whereas in the third one, it constitutes given information in support of a different piece of content, namely that the actor's action of stopping is simultaneous with that of the clock. The prosodic and syntactic structures of the utterances confirm this interpretation. We can therefore observe that the verb uqaf is realized with qaf as long as it conveys new information, whereas it is switched to gaf as the information it conveys ceases to be new. Accordingly, in the following utterances, the same lexeme as well as wagif take the phoneme gaf, as the information they convey, which is the same as the previous utterances, is by now considered as given by the speaker, and its function is just that of supporting the new content of each utterance, which is reported in italics in the slide. Confirmation to this was provided during an answering test concerning another prank in the same test session. During this, DMN answered to one of my questions with a single waqif with qaf, in what was obviously the expression of a single piece of new information. With the following slide, a second example is provided of the use of qaf and gaf for the signaling of information structure, this time through another lexeme.
أصاك شي واحد كيجي كتحطو في الحمار كيبقى وقدام هذاك الحمار قدام داك الفوغاج اوتوماتيكمون كاين واحد البوليسي جالس كيشوفك انت ما تقدرش تزيد حيناش الفيروج شاعل وقدامك البوليس حرق الضوء الاحمر يبقى اشاك فوا كيحاول شي وكيبقى الناس كيدوزو كيمشيو كيجيو يكون اخر باقي حاصل قدام البوليس الفو كيبغي يرجع الفو كيبغي يزيد كيبغي انيوري كيدير ليه البوليس يرجع.
In this excerpt, LT is explaining that, in the prank, a driver is forced to wait on a very long-lasting red traffic light and cannot jump it because a policeman is standing there. To convey this, he uses the lexeme qaddam 3 times with qaf. Here, too, the lexeme appears to convey new information. In the first two occurrences, it reveals the policeman's position with respect to the red light, whereas in the third one, more than the policeman's position, it conveys his threatening presence that prevents the driver from moving. A few seconds later, the same lexeme is realized with gaf, as it conveys once again the effect of the policeman's presence on the driver, which LT treats now as given information. He can also do this because he has just received from GP a confirmation that he understood LT's previous narration, which allows LT to provide new content to his interlocutor. Similar conclusions were arrived at in the analysis of most of the other cases of phoneme switches. However, a minor part of the phoneme switches cannot be interpreted in the information structure framework. The switch shown in the following excerpt has to be explained in a different manner.
كيتم جاي بنان وكيبان ليه الضوء الاحمر كون كيشعل كيوقف كيبقى واقف والبوليسي جالس كيقرا لك كيتعطل زعما الضوء الاحمر بنان كيبقى تيشوف ما كيبغي يزيد تيصفر عليه البوليسي كيقول له وقف قيد لي مخالفه لا ماشي كيقيد لي مخالفه شنو هي مخالفه كيقول ليه رجع وقف.
In this excerpt, IC is verbalizing the same red light prank. He usually employs the phoneme qaf on both the verb uqaf and the participle waqif. The only use of gaf for uqaf happens while he is imagining to reproduce the policeman's voice in direct speech. This seems to suggest that IC has changed phoneme for the purpose of voicing contrast. This is a concept used by Aga to indicate the juxtaposition of pieces of text, each making use of a different set of linguistic features. Each set of features is associated to a specific social group or value, so that it sort of reproduces a different voice with respect to the other pieces of text. In the case at hand, IC may have employed the phoneme gaf as a part of a voicing contrast strategy in order to reproduce the policeman's voice. His use of waqaf, in another instance of direct speech a few seconds later, may be due to the fact that here he is trying to make up for his interlocutor's manifested failure to comprehend what IC had previously said. This may mean that here the aim to make himself clear is more relevant to IC than the aim to color his narration through the juxtaposition of voices, hence the failure to reassign the lexeme to the gaf phonological class. In conclusion, we can observe some weak and strong points in the use of the hidden camera test for data collection. Obviously, some elements of the test situation are likely to cause the informants to adjust their speech to it. The researcher's presence and intermission in the answering task, and also the general scientific purpose of the encounter, although most of the informants did not seem to adjust their speech too much, especially during the verbalization task. Apart from this, I believe that a great number of advantages can be enumerated for the use of this test for the elicitation of linguistic data. First of all, it diverts the speakers from engaging in open metalinguistic discourse by simulating a real-life situation, engaging them in a challenge, make the other person understand the video without watching, and most of all, concealing the targeted forms. I never revealed what lexemes I was looking for, and none of the informants found it out, or at least didn't mention that. From a technical point of view, the feasibility of the test, which I performed 19 times in total, proved that the type of speech situation that it created, although artificially, could be regularized, thus producing linguistic performances highly comparable with each other. This makes it a technique applicable for the sociolinguistic study of a whole community, with adequate time and means being made available. Also, the fact that the target lexemes were often produced more than once by the same informant allowed to verify micro-context related differences in language use, which brought to the surface subtle nuances of variation as we observed. In the case of my research subject, it conducted two new unprecedented findings concerning the relation between phoneme choice and information structure. This may bring new insights in the study of linguistic variation and change, and of processes of meaning making, especially in colloquial Arabic varieties. The final output of a recorded test session consists of whole spoken texts, so the same findings may be counterchecked on other variables in the same texts. This may be also used for the analysis of lexical repertoires and discourse strategies available to a population of speakers. Here you find a little bibliography for those who are interested in the theoretical issues which I dealt with, and I thank you for your attention.